And we're absolutely delighted to have so much homegrown talent on show in the first panel. And first of all, I would like to invite Professor Karen Kilby, who is the Bede Professor here in Durham, and will need virtually no introduction, but she's going to get a very brief one anyway. Karen is known for her work particularly on Rana and on Balthasar, on questions of the Trinity, on questions of evil, and most recently her work has been a really interesting and very substantial collaboration with the Sisters of La Retraite on questions of suffering and diminishment in the Christian life. And she's going to speak to us in this session now on mystery and the contours of the Church, revisiting Rana.
Thank you very much, Anna, who did everything practical except introduce herself. So could I introduce my colleague Anna Rowlands, who holds the St. Hilda Chair in Catholic Social Thought and Practice, retrospectively. So our thoughts about the conference were that it would move between the more academic and the more accessible genres, and you're now moving into the more academic. So in this paper in particular, in line with the subtitle Revisiting Rana, I hope to do two things. First, to offer some remarks on the reception of the theology of Karl Rahner, and secondly, to take one small bit of Rahner's thought, a bit which can be found in his 1972 book, The Shape of the Church to Come, as a jumping off point for reflection on the role of theologians in relation to the Church. The first part is a vehicle for commenting on the state of Catholic theology today, and the second part for a reflection on how theology, including academic theology, might orient itself to the Church. If you're not academically inclined, the first part may be a good occasion for a gentle snooze. I hope the second part will still be moderately interested, but the first part is a little bit of a inner discussion among theologians, so forgive me for that. So first of all then, the question of the reception of Rahner. Rahner's status as a theologian varies dramatically at the moment, depending on to whom you speak and where you are. In certain places, including Durham, he's considered a source of theological depth and wisdom. In others, he's dismissed, sidelined, regarded as a passing fad. I met a PhD student enrolled in a leading US doctoral program a few years ago who told me that she one time mentioned Rahner in a seminar and was laughed at in response, so she learned never to do it again. Given that variety of attitudes, there's a sense in which it's simply not possible to come up with a single overall assessment of the state of Rahner's reception. Nevertheless, if one compares Rahner to Hans-Urs von Balthasar, considers the quantity of publications about each in the last couple of decades, the number of PhDs written about each, the availability and affordability of translations of the works of each, then I think it's safe to say that whatever the pockets of enthusiasm, Rahner is not overall well received in the Anglophone theological world at the moment. I don't want to attempt a full explanation of how this has come to be, but I want to mention what I think should be one strand in any such explanation, an interesting strand, I think, which has to do with the dynamics of ecumenical engagement. Most of us suppose that ecumenical engagement, and I'm not thinking of formal institutional dialogues here, but the simpler and more widespread phenomenon of academic ecumenism, of scholars in one tradition immersing themselves in the study of works of those in another. Most of us suppose this is a thing to be admired. A young theologian makes a choice to invest time and effort in developing a sympathetic understanding of the thought of another tradition. The hope is to be enriched from the other and to do one's bit for the cause of ecclesial rapprochement. It's a generous impulse. We all know this. What's easier to miss, however, are some of the possible political consequences for the other tradition of this effort at generosity. If I determine that I want to learn from another tradition, I have to decide to which voice or voices within it I'll listen, which voices represent that tradition most authentically. I won't have time to grapple with a whole range of what's available. After all, it's not my tradition. And then, of course, the ecumenically minded theologian may have no intention of making final judgments of value or authenticity. One knows one can't do everything. One trusts that a partial engagement is better than none. Still, a decision has to be made. And it's worth thinking about what influences this decision. Most obviously, a young scholar will probably opt for someone they've heard about, someone that everyone else in their own world, or at least the most important people in their own world, talk about. So if nothing else, there's likely to be a clustering effect in this kind of informal scholarly ecumenism. Beyond this, there may be an inclination to choose that which seems most exotic, most different from what I'm used to, but which also perhaps conforms to a pre-existing sense I might have of the otherness of the other. And then, of course, ecumenical generosity will mean that in the vicinity of anything I associate with the otherness of the other, I should be slow to criticize. Sorry, that's all a little bit abstract. But in the context of Protestant and Anglican engagements with 20th century Roman Catholic thought, more concretely, there's tended, after some initially broader reconnaissance missions, to be a clustering around de Lubac, and especially around Balthasar, and a move away from any real engagement with Rahner. And I think there's been a sense that if one approaches a Catholic figure in a spirit of ecumenical generosity, there are dimensions of their thought about which one deliberately refrains from critique, or at least where one deliberately, significantly mutes the critical response. Dimensions around, for instance, gender, sexuality, and authority. What's the point of trying to be ecumenically engaged if one is just going to make a fuss about what everyone already knew in advance was different about Catholics? So figures associated with communio, and particularly Balthasar, have been embraced with some enthusiasm by ecumenically generous Protestants and Anglicans in spite of attitudes towards authority and gender. And this has happened during roughly the same period that such figures have arguably been attractive to ecclesially conservative elements within Catholicism, in part because of their attitudes towards authority and gender. The combined effect of these two forces, that of ecclesially conservative Catholics and deliberately open-minded non-Catholics, has been to give the impression in many circles that the exciting, rich, deep thing available in Catholic theology of the last century or so is to be found in Hans Urs van Balthasar and the Communio theologians, and that Rahner turns out to have been a passing fad. To dwell on these ecumenical patterns a little longer, it's worth noticing that if Protestant readers try to assimilate Catholic theology to a familiar template, they may well see in Rahner and Balthasar something very like a Schleiermacher-Barth opposition. Balthasar is read as the Catholic Barth, the renewed, vigorous voice of Catholic tradition in our time. Rahner is read as a mistaken liberal attempt at accommodation to modernity. This is, in my judgment, however, a strikingly misleading lens through which to approach Catholic theology. It's true, of course, that Balthasar, with his extraordinary breadth of reading and reference, has enriched contemporary theology by the introduction of many voices from the tradition. But look a little deeper and one begins to notice that there are a whole series of central issues on which Rahner remains aligned with, and Balthasar departs from, the classical theological tradition. Issues of simplicity, impassibility, Chalcedonian Christology, issues of the non-competitive understanding of the creator-creature relationship, the avoidance of tritheism. If anyone is usually associated with Schleiermacher, it seems to me it's Balthasar. The Balthasar of the theological aesthetics, more concretely, offers some fascinating parallels with the Schleiermacher of the speeches, with the romantic intellectual concern to defend religion in the realms of high culture. And on the other hand, if one supposes, as I think we should, that there is present in Christian tradition an apophatic theological instinct, an apophatic instinct that's not limited to the periphery, but runs right through the very center of classical Christian theology, then Rahner can be understood as the representative of this apophaticism in the 20th century, transposed into an existentialist experiential key. To put it very briefly, the reception of these figures might begin to be corrected if we learned not to align Balthasar with tradition and Rahner with modernity, but to hear Rahner as the voice of tradition in the rhetoric of modernity, and Balthasar as the voice of modernity in the rhetoric of tradition. All this is a roundabout way of saying that the time is right for renewed engagement with and retrieval of Rahner, not as a figure who has everything sewn up, so that we could content ourselves with a Rahner scholasticism, as has been a temptation in some periods of the past, for he surely does not have everything sewn up. But Rahner is nonetheless a rich and deep thinker with whom we've not yet finished reckoning, a thinker to whom we can turn both in order to wrestle with some central systematic issues, and someone from whose broader commentary, wisdom, and insights we can continue to benefit. Ideally, I should give a little substance to this claim by drawing in the second half of my paper on both these sides of Rahner's theology, both its difficult systematic depths and the more accessible wisdom embedded in Rahner's commentary on pastoral, spiritual, and ecclesial matters. It was in the hope of doing that I put both mystery and church into my title. But in the end, I realized I'd bitten off more than I could chew in 20 minutes. So in fact, I'll confine myself. This is where you can stop snoozing, if you like, in the next few minutes, to an engagement with some of Rahner's more accessible ecclesial commentary. Not simply to repeat Rahner, but to use him as I think we ought to use him as a jumping-off point for further thinking. The Shape of the Church to Come was published in 1972 and written in the context of a synod of the German Church. It's by no means Rahner's most serious work of theology. It's composed of a series of short, sketchy chapters, and it tosses off analyses, proposals, and criticisms at great speed. Its fundamental goal is to offer something like a unifying vision to this particular synod. The German synod took place in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. The final session had finished 6 years before the synod opened in 71. Rahner's stance towards Vatican II in this text is interesting. As you'll probably know, in our own times, the Council, whether as an event or as a set of documents, often takes on the status of a central item to be interpreted and thought over. It's that to which one goes back and claims in one way or another for one's own or for one's party. There's no sign of this, however, in the Rahner of the early 70s. He grants that the Council was an important thing, which he says ought not to be depreciated either from the right or from the left. But it was just too general to be of much use, or at least of much use as the German Church considered its concrete future. Furthermore, much of Vatican II, Rahner wrote in 1972, was already dated. While he's keen that the Church should avoid what he calls a very dubious conservatism, which is becoming virulent as the euphoria of Vatican II is fading, his proposed alternative is not that it wrapped itself up in the mantle of the Council, but it said that it tried to take a serious look at the reality in which it finds itself and make a genuine decision about how to respond. What is that reality? The Church in Germany, Rahner suggests, is at the start of a period of transition. The transition from a Volkskirche, a church sustained by its homogeneously Christian society and almost identical with it, to something much smaller, a church formed of individuals who've taken an explicit decision of faith against the grain of the wider culture. During the period of transition, both kinds of church will exist alongside one another. The church will be a church of non-simultaneity. That's a nice phrase. The leadership of the church has a choice then, either to see the change that's coming about and really grapple with it, or to continue tending to the remnants of the Volkskirche, resisting, this is his quotation, resisting decisions in favor of the future until they are extorted from it, groaning behind developments instead of leading. There are passages within this text which allow glimpses into the particular political dynamics at the moment of writing, and others which, from the perspective of more than half a century on, can seem striking in their predictive power. An example of the latter is Rahner's account of the coming diminishment of the German Catholic Church. A diminishment both in the number of practicing Catholics and in the number of those who are nominal church members. Of the latter group, he writes, for instance, "However unpleasant it may be, we must allow for the fact that social conditions in the long or short run may be so transformed, whatever the cause of this may be, that civic respectability and normality will no longer require a person to be a baptized Christian, to pay church tax, or send his children to denominational religious instruction, to add a religious touch to marriages and funerals, that it will soon be no longer socially out of place or damaging to withdraw officially from the church." The change he thinks is coming need not be driven by anything dramatic, by any striking political upheavals. In our modern society, there are plenty of causes, he writes, leading slowly and unobtrusively to such a situation, so that only a single situation, perhaps insignificant in itself, is necessary to let loose a rapid and numerically very great falling away from the church. He's not exactly forecasting the sex abuse crisis or the various financial scandals in Germany with bishops and their bathrooms or bedrooms, but he does seem to anticipate that an unpredictable event will play something very like the role in the church's ongoing loss of power, prestige, and respectability that these kinds of things play. In any case, what I find most striking in Rahner is not the accuracy of his prediction of a diminishment to come, but the calmness with which he makes the prediction. There's no sense of hand-wringing. There's no anxiety to apportion blame. Even more striking, there's no proposal of a strategy to ward off the coming diminishment. No suggesting that if only we get our theology right, or our liturgy, or our mission, we'll be in a position to stop and reverse the slippage. There's an acceptance that things happen for reasons which, at least in part, are larger than anything within church control. Something which follows from what Rahner lays out, even if it's not something that he himself developed as much as he might, is that one entirely appropriate response to the situation he describes in Germany, and by extension we might say in much of Europe, is sadness. Something is in decline. Something is being lost. Not everywhere in the world, of course, and even in Europe, it may not be in all its forms that Christianity or even Catholicism has been in diminishment. There are also signs of vitality, of new life. Nevertheless, in a fairly short period of time, there has been, and continues to be, a major decline. And this means that there will be many in this generation and in generations to come for whom Christianity will not be a live option, while it would have been had they been born a generation or two earlier. There will be things that churches as a result cannot do, contributions they cannot make, positive influence they cannot have, creative possibilities they will not fulfill. That a proper response to church decline, or even one dimension of a proper response, might be sadness and a sense of loss, is something not often articulated by theologians. Attention is usually focused in one of two other directions. One possibility is to offer a diagnosis of what's gone wrong and a cure. The problem lies in the wrong path taken at the time of Kant or Schleiermacher or Duns Scotus. Or maybe the problem lies in the fact that church and theology have not kept up with changes in the culture around us. The cure will be a retrieval of a way of thought that preceded Scotus or Kant or Schleiermacher, or else it will lie in being a bit smarter and keeping up with shifts in the world. The other familiar theological response, I think, is to embrace the decline as fundamentally a good thing. It is not loss at all, but gain. The church is finally escaping its long captivity to Constantinianism. We should not be seeking power, influence, and prestige anyway. Losing it is actually a blessing, freeing us to offer more faithful witness. Some narratives of decline are interesting and the work of retrieval can be valuable. But to suppose that if only we get our theology right, all should be well and historic ecclesial declines reversed, seems to put ourselves as theologians too decisively at the center of the story. And again, while I would personally be happy to endorse a lot of the theological critique of Constantinianism, this is not enough to make church decline into a matter of pure gain. Some of what we had may not have been so good as we thought it was. The churches may have been compromised and corrupted by their alignment with establishment and political power. But from this we are not entitled to conclude, I think, that what has been and is being lost is only the corruption and the collusion, only that which needed to be purged. But is it not a tenet of Christian faith that the Holy Spirit is at work in the church, and that the Spirit will not abandon the church? And what about the role of providence? What about hope? None of those commitments, I'd like to suggest, to the role of the Spirit in the church, providence, hope, rule out the possibility of losses, which are genuine losses, and over which it's possible to mourn. When a person dies, it may be that it's their fault. They smoked, they didn't exercise. It may be that they've accomplished all they could in life, fulfilled their potential, and given all they had to give. But neither of those things is necessarily the case. A person may die through no fault of their own, and a person may die while still in their prime, vocation unfulfilled. By analogy, I think we should be able to say that something in the church, some version of church, some dynamism, some institutional presence, can come to an end or be severely diminished through no fault of its own or not only through its own fault, but at least in part because of larger forces beyond its control. And this may happen even if there was something good and valuable and necessary in this expression of the Church. The fact that it can diminish and die is no proof that it never was worthwhile, or that it's no longer needed. It may be proof of nothing more than that there are broader social causes leading, as Ronner said, slowly and unobtrusively in a certain direction. Mourning, sadness, and loss, none of these can, of course, be the last word in Christian theology. But without acknowledging that a loss really is a loss, that diminishment is not in itself a good, we may distort our capacity to think well. Without some recognition that these words capture something of the Church's situation now, even if we don't believe they capture its very deepest truth or its final meaning, without this, there's the danger that an anxious nostalgia or a pugnacious self-assertion shapes our thought. So while talk of sadness and mourning may seem a little depressing for the first paper in a celebratory conference, giving it some space can, I think, serve actually a positive role. To mourn that which was good in what we have lost, or in what we are losing, is to honor that which is passing away, to acknowledge it as the good gift of God that it was. Sadness, in this sense, can be a form of the praise of God. Or again, for theologians to acknowledge that the Church may suffer loss, and that it may not be in our power as theologians to prevent the loss, can free us from the anxiety, the arrogance, and the secret lurking sense of failure attached to the unstated assumption that it's our role to rescue the Church. Sadness in this sense can be not only a form of the praise of God, but also a form of liberation. It frees us for the real, creative, and modest contributions to the life of the Church that it is our calling and our joy to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for a hugely stimulating, thought-provoking paper. So you now need to jot down any questions and thoughts you have for Karen, because now you're going to hear another brilliant, stimulating paper, and then all the thoughts will be there. So seriously, if you have got things you want to jot down that you want to ask Karen at the end, do remember to jot them down. In the meantime, I'm now delighted to welcome Professor Paul Murray, who is, it will be a great surprise to you to learn, the Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Durham, and also the Dean Director of the Centre for Catholic Studies. And his current work is a monograph project entitled Catholicism Transfigured, Conceiving Change in the Church.
So a good time to peruse that booklet in the pack. I've given a ridiculously long title to this. Sometimes The Keys of the Kingdom, Unpicking the Locks and Unblocking the Stops, on Genuine Mutual Accountability in the Catholic Ecclesial System. So I will get to that, but I'm going to start by a few further reflections on Paul's world, really, the task of theology as I understand it to be, and that will this will illustrate it a wee bit. As I said earlier, the purpose of these plenary sessions is to showcase the kinds of ways in which we're each seeking to go about the critical, constructive task of Catholic theology. And as I also earlier indicated, I approach this task as one of analysing the understanding and practice of faith in a given context, and the questions, issues, and difficulties which arise there, with a view to showing how best to address such questions and issues on the one hand, and how to make repair of any difficulties or the difficulties that we're seeking to focus on the other hand, and thereby seeking to enhance the quality of Catholic understanding and practice. Another way of putting that would be to say that I see the task of theology as a matter of exploring how, in various specific regards, the webs of Catholic doctrine and practice might be rewoven with what is sometimes referred to as dynamic integrity, with that notion of integrity preserved and deepened with a certain dynamism to it. Now, there are a number of things that follow from this way of approaching things. Firstly, whilst allowing the role of description and explanation in theology, this is not a primarily descriptive or explanatory. Thank you. I'll put my teeth in. Explanatory understanding of the theological task. Transmission, teaching, and catechesis have, I think, their place in academic theology and not just other forms of theology. But if that's all that's going on, transmission, teaching, and catechesis, then I would say theology is in danger of reducing down to what I've heard Karen in other contexts refer to as magisteriology. Again, whilst allowing for the role of celebration, aesthetics, and liturgy in theology, I mean, genuinely so. I also want to say that this way of doing theology is not a primarily appreciative understanding of the theological task. Celebration, inspiration, and deepened appreciation for the beauty and depth of the tradition have, again, I think, their place in academic theology. But if that's all that's going on, then it's in danger, I think, of becoming distorted into a form of idolatrous reification. And kind of in tune with this, whilst allowing also, and this is perhaps most contentious, whilst allowing also for the role of vision in theology, genuinely so, that has a real place. Both the appreciative, searching vision of hidden depths lost from view, here as Osman, and the critical prophetic vision of fresh perception and possibility, here as Ornamento. Again, I want to say that vision, and that this approach to theology is not a primarily visionary understanding of the theological task. What do I mean by that? Deepened and restored vision and renewed and expanded vision each have their proper place in academic theology. But again, I would say if that's all that's going on, then it's in danger of floating off into a poetic idealism rather than an effective poiesis and praxis. Whilst the good book tells us that people die for lack of vision, that might be so. But vision alone, I want to say, is not going to plug the holes in the bark of the church. For that we need, as Nick Healy has been reminding us for some years, we need, in addition, hands-on involvement with the living, breathing, and generally somewhat messy reality of the church. So, if you like, this is an understanding of the theological task which has sought to take Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach to heart as a sound indictment of much academic labour. The problem, paraphrasing, the problem with philosophers is that they just explain the world, whereas the real point is to change it. And also worth saying here is that this is an understanding of the theological task that takes seriously the degree to which it is embroiled, whether it likes it or not and needs to get real about this, the degree to which it's embroiled in intra-ecclesial politics, and the need, therefore, to operate with a certain theological and ecclesial astuteness if we are really to effect the change that is held to be required and that is desired. And I think that astuteness means something to do with seeking ways of building consensus, building fresh consensus, and seeking to serve a communion of understanding. In contrast, then, to the other possible approaches to theology to which I've been alluding, this is an understanding which views the theological task as primarily diagnostic and transformative in orientation. Both critical diagnosis as to where the Catholic system is under strain in some specific regard, and constructive, reparative diagnosis. Is that prognosis? I'll take a lesson off Mary McHugh later. As to what might most appropriately be done in order to remedy this strain in the Catholic system. In holding the critical and the constructive together in this manner, this is to make clear that this is not a matter of mere complaint or denunciation, but is seeking to be a matter of responsible shared participation in seeking to deepen and to enhance the quality of lived Catholic communion and thereby the witness that Catholic communion gives in the world. So as such, one helpful image for this understanding of the theological task might be that of the doctor, the medical practitioner, concerned to serve the health and flourishing of the ecclesial body of Christ. Or another helpful image might be that of the engineer, concerned for the efficiency, elegance, and sound function of the Catholic system. In each case, the entry point for inquiry, the portal through which access is made, is the challenge posed by a presenting dysfunction, or what I've elsewhere called an example of pragmatic incoherence. You might say the entire talk is an example, not just of pragmatic incoherence, but conceptual, but that's another matter. But the point is not simply to explain the pathology or dysfunction, not simply to point to it, but to ask at minimum how to live well with it. Not all pathologies can be cured, sometimes we just need to learn how to live well with them. And also, where possible, how to overcome it. Now, the particular area of ecclesial dysfunction that I have in view this afternoon relates to a basic pathology of unidirectional authority and accountability, which is basically repeated at different levels of Catholic life, and which is attendant upon, consequential upon, interrelated with the hierarchical ordering of the Catholic system as this is currently structured. Now let me be clear, hence I say as this is currently structured. Let me be clear, I am not saying either that Catholic order or that an asymmetric, differentiated model of Catholic ecclesial authority are themselves pathological. The Catholic communion is a sacramental body, and we need, therefore, people of the sacraments. Indeed, I would say we need representative sacramental people, the ordained. Similarly, it is both a basic de facto truth of human organisations that there needs to be structure and authority, and a Catholic theological truth, indeed, why put the qualifier there, a theological truth, that there's always been differentiated authority in the community around Jesus. What I'm focusing on here then is not the basic and necessary facts of order and differentiated authority, but what I regard as the dysfunctional ways in which these have become routinized in the Catholic system into, and here's the phrase again, unidirectional, hierarchical structures of authority and accountability, wherein at every level it all effectively flows in one direction only. Now, I recognise I'm caricaturing and there's lots of qualifiers here, but I'm going for the big picture. Where at each and every significant level, it all effectively, in real terms, on the whole, the default, the weight towards it, is to all flowing in one direction only. The relationship of bishop to pope, the relationship of diocese to bishop, the relationship of parish to priest, without there being any real routine counter-accountability to offset this. Now, sure, at every level there are various relevant bodies, whether it's the Synod of Bishops at the international level, or whether it's diocesan synods at the regional level, or and diocesan pastoral councils, or whether it's parochial pastoral councils at the local level. But the function of each of these, to greater or lesser degree, is purely consultative, to greater or lesser degree. Again, qualifiers are needed. And to use the language in the Code of Canon Law, which just is repeated over and over again throughout, the function of these bodies is to assist and cooperate with the proper respective roles of Pope, bishop, and parish priest at these three levels, who operate as the unqualified executive. Okay? And that's a word I'm going to keep using, executive function, how we do that properly. Now, what I'm wanting to, I mean, this is big picture, broad brushstroke cartoon stuff, I recognise, but I'm trying to provoke you with it. I want to just point to three overlapping indicators of there being something awry with the performance of this system. Firstly, well, let's think of the profound ecumenical difficulties which are created by this still very strongly pyramidal dispensation and ordering of Catholic authority in juridical terms. And those with ears to hear will recognise that I'm articulating really what comes out of the Code of Canon Law and therefore the kind of formal practice of our church rather than the other strains of ecclesiology which people might find in Lumen Gentium or somewhere. I'm dealing with what we kind of deal with in reality. In the ecumenical context, let's take the Anglican Catholic context as one example where this comes sharply to press. Well, the fact that we share, as we have shown through ARCIC, the fact that we share an enormous amount in common between Anglicans and Catholics in relation to our theologies of ordination, presbyterate, and episcopacy is kind of made somewhat irrelevant by the fact that we really have very different ways of structuring authority and ecclesial accountability in practice. I mean, the one does not easily map onto the other at any of the levels, parochial, diocesan, or international. And the Catholic tendency, of course, has sometimes been to assume, I'm sure we've grown out of this now, but has sometimes been to assume that if we just grind away at the formal ecumenical game for long enough, and then the others will eventually come to accommodate themselves to the wisdom of Catholic ways of thinking and structuring. Well, guess what? That's an ecumenical strategy that is going nowhere. And given the fact that we Catholics, from one papacy to another since Vatican II, every single pope since Vatican II, time and time again, keeps emphasising the non-negotiable nature of Catholic commitment to walking the way of Christian community, saying it's intrinsic to the nature of Catholicism to be bought into this. Then if we're that serious about it, then it's high time we started looking at a different ecumenical agenda that will serve us, that will serve that walk. And what's going to be required, I would say, is for us to begin asking what it might mean for the ways in which Catholic structuring of authority might need to move in the direction of a genuine mutual accountability at every level that still nevertheless preserves, and this is the important thing, for those of you who think, he's just making us a bunch of liberal Democrats. I'm not. Because a way of having mutual accountability that nevertheless preserves appropriate differentiation and also preserves appropriate executive capacity. Fascinatingly, both John Paul II and Pope Francis have had very significant things to say which resonate with this. So that's the first reason why I want to say we've got to do something about this and look at it. That's one of the ways in which the stress is coming to the fore in the ecumenical context. Again, and I'm just going to skate over this. A second one, well, it's just the basic sense of widespread experience, frustration with the current dispensation. And again, at every level of Catholic life. It is not uncommon to hear frustration expressed by bishops, normally off the record, but not always, about the way in which the Synod of Bishops has been operating prior to this papacy. It's not uncommon to hear frustration at diocesan level with the way in which diocesan structures operate, and indeed at parochial level. But let's just skate over that and acknowledge that basic sort of lived frustration. A third way in which this all comes out is, and most traumatically, is the way in which we've experienced the traumatic exposure in recent years, recent decades, of the complicity of the existing Catholic default towards unidirectional lines of authority and accountability in helping to create the conditions in which clerical sexual, I'm not saying it's all its fault, but it is complicit in it, as many other factors are, complicit in helping to create the conditions in which clerical sexual abuse could be at once unthinkable, invisible, endemic, and routinely mismanaged. In this light, serious, critical, constructive self-examine of our theology and structures of Catholic order and ecclesial authority is not simply a matter of alleviating experienced Catholic frustration, nor is it simply a matter to do with external-facing ecumenical relations. But of course, ecumenical relations are never simply an external-facing matter. At its sharpest, this is to do with a need that goes to the heart of our calling to be as sacrament of the kingdom and to be as credible and attractive witness to creation's communion in the Trinitarian communion of God. So hence it appears that serious reform, really beginning to take seriously the need to reform this unidirectional, etc., Catholic default, is less a step which needs to be taken if there's to be any further real ecumenical progress. It does need to be taken further, but it's not just to do with that. This is to do with a step which Catholicism will only actually be able to take if it actually engages in some serious ecumenical learning, which is aimed at offering repair to this area of profound Catholic dysfunction. Earlier, I said that the constructive task of theology needs to be pursued with a certain ecclesial political astuteness in ways that can build communion and new consensus, and thereby actually effect real change rather than just bang a drum. Well, having identified something of this, something dysfunctional in Catholic habits of mind and practice, the instinct then must be to, I think, do three things. Firstly, to ask as to what it is in this specific regard that is essential to maintain in the overall Catholic web. Secondly, to ask what are the relevant interests and perspectives in the Church which need to be protected, and that is plural and frequently in apparent competition with each other. And thirdly, as to how some felicitous reweaving might be pursued, which retains and even strengthens what is essential and significant, whilst ameliorating or even overcoming what's dysfunctional. And I want to suggest, I think, that this needs to be done at the level of the relevant, both at the level of the relevant doctrinal understanding which is in play, and at the level of practice, procedure, and structure as backed by juridical prescription. Let me indicate, and simply indicate, two possible lines of exploration here which relate to this unpicking the locks, unblocking the stops on the Catholic ecclesial system. One of these lines of exploration is doctrinal, the other more practical, structural, procedural. Taking the doctrinal first, and specifically here, thinking in relation to the theologies of ordained ministry and clerical distinctiveness, which lie behind and lend weight to the unidirectional, strict differentiation of effective authority of governance between clergy and laity that is written into the code very, very clearly. As I've argued on previous occasions, if Catholic theology of ministry is actually to be able to overcome the competitive binary, as I see it, into which it's been locked since the Council, by the notion of a competitive binary in theology of ministry, what I mean is that whereas some emphasize the distinct dignity of the ordained to the diminishment of the laity, others have emphasized the proper dignity of the baptized, but at the cost of appearing to move us towards, at the cost of appearing to reduce the ordained to mere functionaries. We've been locked into that binary since the Council, I think, in Catholic theology of ministry. And I want to suggest that if that binary is to be overcome and to move us towards an integrated theology of ministry around which the whole Church can gather with all due interests protected, then I think we need to discover a much stronger representative or even sacramental understanding of ministry, such that the ordained are to be seen as the official, public, visible, formally designated representatives of what the entire priestly, kingly, prophetic, people of God are. In other words, I want to say that the real distinction between ordained and lay is that the ordained have a fundamentally different mode of exercising the one priesthood of Christ in the church. A fundamentally different mode in the fact that it is visible, public, representative, formally representative, sacramental. Now, much more needs to be said about that, but you'll be pleased to know that I don't intend to inflict it on you now.
2 minutes more.
2 minutes, thank you. I am on my last page, and it's big writing, yeah. Because I'm not a very good reader. When all is said and done about our thinking about priesthood and the clerical distinctiveness, that alone will not be enough. Simply reconceptualizing, rethinking how we understand the relationship isn't going to do the job. It is perfectly possible for us to be working out a really good Vatican II model of servant ministry and still nevertheless default instinctively to operating out of habits defined by the fact that all effective power resides with the executive at any given level, whether that be the parochus in the parish, the bishop in the diocese, or the pope and curate in the universal church. I worked for the Archdiocese of Liverpool with Pat. I've worked in a Catholic higher education college, worked in a seminary, and I've just been a kind of general existent around parishes all my life, etc. And I always find it delightful and amusing when clergy who genuinely have absorbed the Vatican II model of priesthood and really that's how they understand themselves and generally operate, when pushed into a corner, will say, no, don't forget, I'm the one with the power. Okay? So we have here a kind of dissonance going on. What I'm therefore suggesting is we need not just a reform of thought, but a reform of procedure, which allows for genuine lateral and subsidiary accountability, whilst preserving the appropriate executive function and authority of those in leadership. And learning, perhaps through transposition from synodal practice in the Church of England, 2 possibilities I leave you with. Firstly, to require the executive at any level to bring any significant proposal to the relevant wider synodal body for approval, whether it's parish council in the parish or pastoral council in the diocese, etc. And to allow for this proposal to be brought for approval, say, for up to 3 times, so that there's genuine consensus being built. Now, you might say, well, that just flattens everything and takes away real executive leadership. So I want to put a spin on this and say, well, to preserve a kind of Catholic instinct for executive authority, what we could do is to reserve the extraordinary right to the executive in extremis to push something through, to push through an unpopular proposal if pastoral circumstances are deemed to require it, but in a way that alters the default fundamentally, in a way that requires justification for something being pushed through in that way, and that is recognised as being outside the norm, rather than just, well, that's how we do things in the Catholic world. Secondly, equivalently, to allow synodal bodies to bring proposals, initiatives to the relevant executive, whether it's the parish pastoral council or the diocesan synod or other, the diocesan pastoral council, to bring proposals to the relevant executive up to 3 times within a given time period, and to require that whilst an executive might then rule the proposal, even after 3 formal considerations, might rule such a proposal out of consideration for a given period, saying, not on my watch, Pam. That's something that I don't agree with. I don't think that is responsible. But it can't, you could put a time limit on it, so it can't be ruled out absolutely. A proposal that has support like that can't just be ruled out absolutely forever without it being able to be brought back, say, after a 5 or 10 or something year period. Now, what I want to say is, in one sense, this is a very modest proposal, represents a very modest alteration to the Catholic system, which goes out of its way to seek to preserve the appropriate executive role of leadership at every level, and which also allows the preservation of clear asymmetric differentiation of authority, which I think is proper in the Catholic system. But it would nevertheless, I think, be a highly significant step forward that would enshrine the principle of real mutual accountability and power of initiation at every level of Catholic life in a way that becomes a bit more in tune with the very different default instinct in an Anglican context. This, I want to suggest, might help us to begin unpicking the locks and unstopping the blocks on the Catholic system, and might begin to help us to live in accordance with core Catholic commitments and instincts around which all can gather, but with more fluency, freedom, and appeal. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our final speaker for this session is Professor Nicholas Healy. And Nick does need a bit of an introduction because he's come to us all the way from New York, from St. John University in New York. You'll notice in your packs, if you've got speaker information in your packs, that he alludes in his own biography to a musical career that was briefly attempted and cut short. So you can ask him over dinner what happened to his musical career. But we're rather glad that he remained in theology, and he's going to speak to us now on the question of dissent in Catholic life. Thank you.
This is set up for a cello, I think. I want to set it up for a double bass. We've had struggles with this. How's it been in the back? Is this sort of okay? I probably can't keep this up because I get excited. I just realised listening to the other two, and of course now I've got 27 minutes, right? Listening to the other two, they come at things from a different perspective, and I should perhaps inform you that I'm a lay person who was a lay person, that's it, who I converted to Catholicism many years ago, and but I've never got involved in the kind of parish life, and I'm sorry, but I just haven't, and never wanted to for some reason. I just like going to Mass and praying a bit and that kind of thing. So I'm not familiar with all the stuff that Paul is talking about, and it's certainly very important, I understand. So this is going to be a little different. The new title for the talk is The Church, the Person, and Pneumatological Tension. It's difficult in places, but this bit's easy, I think. According to Scripture and much of the tradition, there are two primary locations where we can be in the presence of the Holy Spirit. One of them is the church, which I'll be talking about mostly. The other is the person, or more specifically, each person's interior space, as Jean-Louis Chrétien calls it in his book, L'Espace Intérieur. This is the chamber, or inner room of Scripture, the place to which one retreats, not to be merely alone, but to be alone with God, who is always already present there. This second location was an essential element of patristic and medieval spirituality, as you probably know, but in recent centuries it has become somewhat obscure in ways I'll mention later. The active presence of the Holy Spirit within these two locations, the church and the person, brings about what I will call pneumatological tension. That is, the Spirit stimulates or nudges both the church and the person in ways that produce complex effects. For example, the Spirit's gift may be to prompt someone to question or challenge herself in some way, or the church to challenge itself, or its members, or the world, and so on. The resulting tensions, for want of a better word, may lead to developments of various kinds that are beneficial for the person or the church, even though they might not appear to be anything like beneficial at the time. Pneumatological tension is the main theme of what follows. A subsidiary concern is to offer an example of what could be, perhaps, if it works, a rather different kind of constructive theology. Constructive theology about the church usually attempts to define what the church was meant to be, and thus ought to be, but at present is not, or not sufficiently. The implication is that if the definition is accepted, changes to the church should follow. For example, if people accepted the idea that the church is best defined as koinonia, or communion, it would follow necessarily that we should abandon and avoid ways of church life that are incompatible with that definition. By contrast, I propose the phrase pneumatological tension as a description, not a definition, but a description of the life of the church and its people, as it already is now and has always been. The phrase is therefore a kind of inductive conclusion from the Church's history. It is a description conditioned by Scripture and doctrine, of course, otherwise it couldn't be a good description. But I do not propose it as a theological definition of the Church. Its function is not to be an agent of change, as university administrators used to say of themselves, but only to describe the Church well. And so I'm not going to suggest that we need to make changes in the Church to make it more pneumatologically tensive. I want to say then that the Church is already and sufficiently pneumatologically tensive, and that the phrase is indeed descriptive. One difference the word pneumatological points to is that we might have a bit more hope, or perhaps less unnecessary despair, at least about the longer term, because we know the Spirit is at work among and within us. But the description, to repeat, is not prescriptive. The way the Spirit works tensively may well continue to upset us and make us feel just as sad or worried about the Church and ourselves as we were before the invention of this description. And that can be entirely appropriate too. Yet perhaps this paper could also be a very preliminary and completely inadequate sketch for an apologia for the Church, for the life of the Church, or for certain important bits of its life at least. The task here then must be to address some of the more obvious challenges to the descriptive accuracy of pneumatological tension within the Church. The tension must be distinguished from the common or garden tension, such as that, say, between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, or the tension generated by cooking competitions on the telly. I have time to consider only one such challenge and have chosen dissent in the broad sense, to include conflicting sensibilities as well as doctrinal and moral disagreements with the magisterium. Because dissent takes significantly different forms in other churches, I'll have to talk only about the Roman Catholic Church. Is this okay still? Yeah, all right, good. Both within and outside Catholicism, there persists in various quarters an understanding of Catholicism as something like a system, this is important to remember, a system of true doctrines and right practices that are oriented towards transcendence and taught by an authoritative teaching office. That's the definition I'll be referring to. And I'll call it the modern definition of Catholicism, since it depends upon a modern sensibility. And by the word modern throughout what follows, I do not mean contemporary, but refer to the broad cultural assumptions changes that began to be developed around 1400, were developed further with the turn to the subject and remain dominant today. I call the modern definition of Catholicism a definition because it functions as a norm to be realized, rather than a description of what actually is. For those who accept it, it rules out dissent, including dissent from the definition by those who do not accept it. Let me just repeat that thing, the definition. A system of true doctrines and right practices that are oriented towards transcendence and taught by an authoritative teaching office. Right? Good. Yes, those who disagree with that can be portrayed as sinful or culpably negligent in their religion. But the trouble with the modern definition is also that it enables others who take it for granted to insist that their dissent from parts of that system is the church authorities' fault. For they can argue that it is not them, but the teaching authorities who have culpably failed to respond to new knowledges, new social contexts and sensibilities, and instead have insisted on maintaining an outdated system unchanged. These two alternatives are not infrequently reflected in theological writing. In order to address dissent in terms of pneumatological tension, we will have to give up trying to define Catholicism, in my sense of define, and instead to try to describe it better, more accurately, so that we can see more clearly why pneumatological tension is descriptively accurate. For a more accurate description of Catholicism, I'm going to turn to religious studies. And this might seem an obvious mistake to many people, and for more than one reason. And indeed it would have been until several decades ago. Back in the day, religious studies scholars took for granted something very like what I call the modern definition of Catholicism. And they went off and applied it to all religions. And on that basis, they constructed various social theories that explained religion as such, which was any help for understanding the religions themselves or for describing them accurately. Fortunately, some intrepid religious studies scholars went off to study non-Christian religions in distant lands. There they belatedly realized that other religions are not best described as authoritative belief systems, nor are they oriented towards transcendence. They are much more concerned with presence within everyday life. And the exciting thing to me, at least, is that in the last decade or so, some of these religionists have looked more carefully at various kinds of Christianity nearer home, including Catholicism. They have found that, although Christianity is probably unique in its emphasis upon belief, it too, as it is actually practiced, is not all that well described as an authoritative belief system oriented towards transcendence, even though some Catholics might think it is, or it should be. On their findings, these new religious studies people, I must be far too brief to convince you, I expect, but I'm just going to say a few things. A growing number of religious studies scholars now describe Christianity, including Catholicism, as a lived religion, to use Meredith McGuire's phrase. Graham Harvey sums up the change. To get an accurate description of any lived religion, including Catholicism, it has to be seen in its performance, embodiment, materiality, and as fluid, accommodative, and permeable. It might be the definitive role of some religious leaders and of some structuring systems to construct and then to police borders, but it is the necessary permeability of boundaries, the everyday fact of their transgression, that is more truly definitive of lived religion than any elite imagination of fixed and secure boundaries. Most of us, we are told, develop our own particular way of living as a Catholic, picking out what is useful, rejecting what we find wrong or useless, as a kind of bricolage. Robert Orsi's work has shown how the presence of the holy within lived Catholicism has been vital for understanding the laity's relative independence, noting that what the Virgin Mary or the saints have had to say to ordinary people has often challenged the authority, behavior, and less often the teachings of the Church. And ethnographic studies, such as Jakob Thorstein's wonderful account of congregations in Guatemala, show how lay Catholics engage in a kind of communal bricolage that puts them at some distance from their clergy. We might think all this dissent is a new phenomenon, perhaps brought about by modernity. But lived Catholicism today is in important ways very similar to the lived religion of the pre-modern Church, supporting Bruno Latour's case that we have never been really all that modern. From the work of historians such as Peter Brown, Carolyn Bynum, Eamon Duffy, and many others, it seems that historically, although virtually all persons were members of a single church, that membership was a minor part of their religion as lived, which was somewhat eclectic and much more central to their everyday lives than was the church part alone. Among the theological elite, the concern in pre-modern times was not to maintain a second-order system of beliefs oriented towards transcendence, but as de Lubac, Louis Ayres, Francis Young, and others tell us, patristic theologians read the Bible as essentially a transformative text, because the ethos of patristic theology was never divorced from prayer and the life of the church. Note the two locations reference prayer, life of church, individual church. Not least because they knew that presence forever exceeds the bounds set for it. And of course, there are many Catholics who have interiorized to some greater or lesser extent the modern definition, fair enough. And while they might accept my description of lived religion, past and present, they will point out that just because dissent from authoritative teaching has always been with us, it doesn't at all follow that it's okay. And they might go on to complain that they seem to be trying to legitimate the narcissistic spiritualities of our individualistic culture. In response, I would admit, it is true, of course, that lived Catholicism is often distorted and sinful, certainly my own. And I realize that it would not be enough for me to point to those theologies and church teachings, or omissions thereof, that also show signs of cultural distortions and are incompatible with truth and goodness. Nor would it be enough for me to point to the failure of some church leaders and clergy to act in ways consistent with Christianity. We know that everyone is sinful, confused, and wrong at least some of the time. But these evident facts do not, as such, put into question the idea that it is always wrong to dissent from the Church's teaching, at least so far. Yet dissent there is, as there always has been. In its 2014 publication on the Sensus Fidelium, the International Theological Commission made a valiant attempt to accommodate what it called legitimate dissent within something like the modern definition of Catholicism. The Commission proposed that lay Catholics can acquire an instinctus, a kind of intuitive sensitivity or instinct that will enable them to recognize when their pastor says something incompatible with Catholic teaching. This instinct is not innate, of course. According to the Commission, to acquire it, one must first give up all resistance to the authority and teachings of the magisterium. This is necessary so that one can be properly formed. Proper formation, in turn, is necessary in order to acquire holiness. And holiness is the necessary and proximate condition for any legitimate dissent. Dissent, therefore, cannot be legitimate if it is dissent from the teachings of the magisterium, because one's formation and holiness is dependent upon our unresisting acceptance of those teachings. Legitimate dissent is thus limited to rejecting a mistaken view of one's pastor or another lay person. There are a number of very interesting difficulties with this proposal, but I have a lot more on that. But I'll skip it and to point out one thing. That the Commission's account of formation in holiness focuses almost exclusively upon the first location, the church, not the person. As such, it stays largely within the modern definition of Catholicism and seems too dependent upon a social theory of formation. The account is one-sided and seems to consist in breaking a person down in order that he or she becomes someone else, rather like the Marine Corps boot camp aims to do. That's not necessarily wrong, I hasten to add, especially for Catholics who live in a closed community. But it ignores the second location, whereas most closed communities do not. In the book I mentioned earlier, Jean-Louis Chrétien offers a detailed account of how our understanding of the person shifted significantly with the Reformation and modernity. Earlier, following Scripture, Augustine and Gregory the Great put much effort into describing the personal location, our inner space, in order that we could properly prepare ourselves to encounter the Spirit present within each of us. Beginning with the early modern period, for various reasons, this inner realm was increasingly profane, as Chrétien puts it, in that it became desanctified, empty of God. Myself became just me, alone. And so arose the various modern accounts of the self as an individual, through Montaigne, Descartes, Kant, Freud, to most contemporary novelists. Given this major change, in addition to various other challenges, the Church has had great difficulty in properly acknowledging the vital contribution of the Spirit within the second location in the person. Without the tension produced within and from the second location, pneumatological tension is lost to some degree. For example, the personal relation to the Spirit in the second location inhibits the modern Church's tendency, in line with some forms of modern science and some modern theologies, to act as if it had access to an impersonal view of the whole, God's view, as it were. The new realist phenomenon, Marcus Gabriel, argues convincingly against this. But more to the point, so does St. Paul, who also reminds us that the scope of the Church's knowledge and teaching is necessarily never whole either. And one of the functions of the pneumatological tension within the person, which gives rise to dissent, is to push the Church to have to acknowledge the second location. I said at the beginning that I'm not trying to change the Church by means of a doctrinal norm. Instead, I'm trying to propose the recovery of a more traditional description of the life of the Church and its members, one that has been obscured theologically, but is still very much active in the layperson's independence of mind and heart. I'd like to think, you will probably correct me about this, but I'd like to think that Pope Francis does something similar at times, though very evidently in a far better way than I. Francis makes much of the Holy Spirit, for it is only the Holy Spirit who teaches us to say Jesus is Lord. I'm quoting quite He acknowledges both spiritual locations. The Holy Spirit, he says, is the travelling companion of every Christian, and also the travelling companion of the church. This is the gift that Jesus gives us. Francis cites his predecessor, Benedict, who used to speak of truth as encounter. That is, not so much a category, like something fixed, but a road. Accordingly, Francis insists that grace cannot take the form of what he calls an ideology, meaning a set of fixed or timeless doctrines and practices. For grace is, he says, an embrace and something more. Who discerns the way forward along the road, then, if not only those who best know the ideology? The Church has sometimes forgotten, Francis reminds us, that it is the holy people of God. And so, if we want to hear the Church, we must listen to the people of God, meaning all the people. Sometimes the people, he says, the laity, do not succeed in expressing themselves well, and at times they may be completely mistaken. But who among us is able to say, I thank you, O Lord, because I have never made a mistake? And I think probably famously now, he also says, Francis says, the people of God have a sense of smell. Because of that, the people can find their way. And so it is necessary for pastors regularly to put themselves behind the people, as the people discern the road ahead and journey along it. With metaphors like these, and without developing anything like a new ecclesiology or a new definition of Catholicism, Francis challenges modern definitions of Catholicism. Yet it is clear that he considers the Church as necessarily a hierarchical institution, and he is not suggesting we abandon the difference between the clergy and the laity, nor the difference between theological experts and ordinary folk, nor assume that everyone has the right to think and do as they wish without being challenged. He seems to accept, even encourage, the resulting tensions, because they are the product of the Spirit's work in the person and the Church. We are meant to disagree and argue. It's our job as Catholics. And knowing that, we need not do our job in any but a friendly, even joyful way. Even though, of course, we probably won't, and we would like to carry on more or less as we always have done. So to conclude, if pneumatological tension is indeed a description of important aspects of the Church and the person and their interrelations, we can, in my view, conclude that we should leave the present organisation of the Church largely as it is, except for some shifts in emphasis that are opened up by means of a more accurate description. The hierarchical structure of the Church is essential for the pneumatological tension that maintains the Church as a work of the Spirit. We will continue to argue, get upset, and posture, rather like Parliament does. And in a similar way, our arguments will sometimes degenerate to become mere party politics, point scoring, and shutting down. I don't see an alternative this side of the eschaton. It seems to be the way the Catholic Church has usually done things, even though some of its theoreticians and leaders have often sought to use clearer, more enlightened, and tidier ways.